AP, welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of that lead up to the explosion of art and creativity and renewal of energy and blah, 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 known as the Renaissance, right? So we are still leading up to the Renaissance a little bit, doing all that first part of the CED for Unit 1, right? Unit 1.1, which is all the context stuff, right? Giving you a lot of the context for why did the Renaissance happen? Where is it coming from? What came before it? Why is it all so different? What was so special about the eras following 1450 that created this new, cultural ethos that is going to exist inside of the place that we are studying, of course, which is the continent of Europe, right? But the big thing about it, though, is we left off talking about in our last flip, discussing the late Middle Ages and how the tragedies of the late Middle Ages, compiled with the growing economics of the High Middle Ages, is actually going to lead to a very, very large injection of funds into the continent of Europe, and it's also going to lead to the growth of some very interesting little city-states, right? And these particular little city-states that we were talking about are the places in northern Italy, Pierre, aren't they? Yes, they're the places in northern Italy, right? We were talking about northern Italian communes and how they kind of showed up out of nowhere, and what those things were are these free associations of men that are like tradesmen and guild workers and things like that are going to start these cities and these states that are actually gone and separated from the feudal system that is taking over most of Europe at the time. Oh, you have to stick your face into the pillows that I have my computer on? That's fine. So the big thing about it, though, okay, is we then started discussing how there were some revolts. But the long and short of it is, we left off from the last flip really, really diving into the idea that, yes, these places were separate from feudalism, right? Yes, feudalism did not grow in these places and did not stifle the economic systems in them like it was doing it in many places in Northern Europe, which some medieval historian is about to get on here and be like, actually, the feudalism, blah, 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 blah. Okay, well, no. But the big thing about it, though, is these communes in northern Italy, okay, are going to try to establish themselves as republics. But the thing about it is that these republics are not authentic republics, right? An authentic republic is supposed to be a thing that is actually going to be ruled by the people, right? That's what the word republic means, right? And if we actually look at the ancient Roman Republic, it was also not even technically ruled by the people, right? Trying to establish a full-fledged republic is something that is extremely difficult, right? Because 9 times out of 10, the wealthy are going to get their hands in it, they're going to start to corrupt things, and they're also going to start using their power and influence to get things that they want to get done. And there's no difference in the northern Italian states, right? In the northern Italian states where the Renaissance is actually going to flourish, a lot of it is going to have to do with the fact that there was these things were established called signores or signorias, which were these ruling lordly power councils, right? Where they were members of all the big guilds. For example, in Florence, there were 9 of them, right? Usually odd numbers. And they're going to actually sit there and use their power and influence, and they're also going to be bribed heavily by some very, very rich families, creating some fake republics that actually kind of seemed like they were republics, but in all actuality, they weren't, right? So the thing about it, though, is these families are going to be coming into these northern states and establishing massive power cells inside of each of them, and then using their money and influence to really change some stuff up, right? Now, for example, the Medici family is going to be in Florence. The Sforza family is going to be in Milan. We'll talk about those places. But before you can really talk about those places, you got to kind of jump over to one of the only city-states in northern Italy that actually did kind of do more of Republican-style stuff, right? And that place is known as Venice, right? Venice is going to be one of the very, very important keystone cities of northern Italy, right? There are 3 of them, the big 3 northern Italian cities that we will discuss. Now, if you were in a European history class with a European historian, they would go off on a tangent and be like, well, actually, it's not limited just to do those powerful 3. There's also Siena and Pisa and et cetera, not Bologna, but Genoa, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's true. Like the northern Italian states, there's a lot of them, right? But the big 3 that we're going to discuss are Venice, Milan, and Florence, right? Now, Venice, the reason why we need to talk about them actually doesn't have a lot to do with their involvement in the Renaissance. We actually have to talk about their involvement in trade and trade industries, right? And how their merchant guilds are going to lead to the growth of exploration later on, right? Something that you need to just kind of store in the back of your mind for Venice is more along the lines of that they were the trade empire city of Italy, right? They were the city that brought all the goods in, right? All that warehouse inventory, all the silks and the spices and all those different items that rich people in Europe could afford and wanted inside of their house, 9 times out of 10, they came through Venice, right? And a lot of it has to do with the fact that they dominated Mediterranean trade by creating a trade system and a trade port system that really, really traded with one particular place. the Byzantine and the Ottoman Empire. Right there is Constantinople, which would later be called Istanbul, right? And of course, at first, it was actually controlled by the Byzantinians, right? And the Byzantinians, those Eastern Romans, we talked about not one, but two flips ago, right? The Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, their city of Constantinople had all those luxury items inside of it, right? Because it was the end of a very, very old trade network road that you probably learned about in middle school, known as the Silk Road, right? The Silk Road brought all types of goods into the Byzantine, right? And all types of goods into the city of Constantinople. And Venice created with them a trade agreement, right? That they would be the sole proprietors and traders of those items because they could easily go straight down this body of water right there known as the Adriatic Sea, sweep up the Aegean, grab all the goods, and then come right back around, right? Now, the idea there in hand, though, okay, the Byzantinians aren't going to last forever. In 1453, write this down, in 1453, the Byzantinians are going to fall to the Ottoman Empire, right? And the Ottomans, which is an Arabic-based and Muslim empire, is going to take over that city, and they're going to change it to, later on to Istanbul, right? And it's now to this day known as Istanbul, and it is one of the most beautiful cities on the planet. I really, really want to go there when I get older. But they kept that trade deal with the Venetians, with Venice, right? And what's going to end up happening when we get into the voyages of Magellan and Vasco da Gama and Diaz, and then as well as Columbus, you're going to see the reason why those guys went off on their little exploratory missions was to try and figure out a way to cut Venice out of the market and go straight to the suppliers of these goods, right? To try and find routes to get to India and to get to China to get those goods that the Venetians had that they would charge so much money for, right? Because they looked over at Venice and they were like, wow, look at all of the money that they are actually making, right? And they did that, and you can see it even in the design of their city. That's why Venice is built on top of water, and their canal system is used to transport all those goods into the city throughout their port system, right? And that's why, of course, you know, like whenever you think of Venice, you think of the guys in the gondolas right here, and like singing as they travel, la, 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 and they do that whole thing. So Venice is an important one. We're going to be referencing them a little bit more later on, right? Now, the second one that's going to be very important is known as Milan, right? And Milan is an absolutely beautiful city. I have been there. It is absolutely gorgeous, right? This is actually me standing inside of the, like, Victor Emmanuel II galleries, which is this building right here that was not built until way later in the 1800s, right? And this, of course, right here is the Cathedral of Milan, which is absolutely beautiful, but again, wasn't really constructed or refined until the 1700s. But Renaissance Milan is going to be a little bit different, right? Their geography and the reason why they made so much money is going to be really important because they were a midway point. They were a trade hub, right? For all the goods that were coming from Venice, these silks, these spices, all of those other items that were coming and making their way into Europe, they had to pass through Milan to get all the way through the Alps, which is the northern, mountain range, the northern mountain range that actually covers the areas of northern Italy. It's pretty hard to traverse, right? But if you want to get through those mountains and get these items to places like the Holy Roman Empire, to France, to England, to all those wealthy families out there in Spain, you need to go through Milan, right? You need to go through Milan, and so all these items and all these things, as it was a midway point between the Holy Roman Empire and Rome itself, is going to really affect their economy. They're also going to be very heavily in manufacturing and agriculture as well. Manufacturing a lot of different textiles is going to be a big thing in Milan. Their government, though, started out with this one family called the Visconti, who actually ruled over it for quite some time, but then in came in the Sforza family, right? Underneath this guy named Francesco I Sforza, who actually married into the Visconti family and actually took it over. Now, he was a mercenary ruler because literally he had a very large army at his back. Now, that's going to become an important thing a little bit later on when we get into the civic humanistic era, right? When a lot of these different philosophers are going to start begging the questions of what type of ruler is the best, right? And it's going to really, really draw heavily from Francesco I's takeover of Milan and kind of beg the questions of, is it a good idea to lead an army? And by the way, what a mercenary is somebody that gets paid to go off and on military campaigns, right? Let's say hypothetically Chappelle didn't have a military, but we want to go invade Mount Carmel, and we wanted to hire a mercenary army. We might go to Dominican because they have an army, and we'll pay them to fight for us, right? So the Sforza family were mercenary rulers, but later on what's going to end up happening is they are going to be conquered by Philip II of Spain, who's going to be really, really important later on in the 1580s, all right? But the Milanese and the Venetians, not the most important two cities, right? But when you really look at the Renaissance period, the best place to look at is none other than the city of Florence, which is my favorite city in Italy by far. It's absolutely gorgeous. I want to go back again so soon. It is beautiful. I have witnessed children cry at how pretty it is and stuff like that, as in kids that I've taken to Italy before. And the biggest reason why Florence is so beautiful and why it's known as the cradle of the Renaissance has a lot to do with one particular family, right? And that family is known as the Medici family, right? Not Medici. It's really annoying when people say that, but the Medici family is probably one of the biggest and most important families that we will ever discuss, and they will be coming up in several different units from now until oblivion, right? Like, so now, patroned by the Medici family, the Florence government, the Florence Signoria, the Florence everything was controlled by this one family, right? Now, the Medici family, starting off with Cosimo the Elder, which is this guy right here, who has a massive equestrian statue of himself in the Piazza della Signoria, which is absolutely beautiful. And then the big thing about it, though, is like he is going to start this whole thing off. And what did he begin that brought so much money to the Medici family, which then brought a lot of money to Florence, is this thing known as the Medici Bank, right? Okay, he created the very, very first large-scale bank inside of northern Italy that is going to be using, be using its vaults and protectionary systems to hold on to the wealth of Europe, right? Now, the big thing about it that we need to understand that some of y'all are probably immediately asking yourself is like, why is the invention of the Medici Bank going to make Cosimo the First so much money, right? Well, Cosimo is going to get a lot of money from this bank because what do banks do with your money? When you give them your money, they spend it, all right? Like, they're going to use it to loan out to other people. They're going to use it to, like, actually create other types of different kind of currency funds. They're going to use it to do whatever they want with it, right? Now, some of y'all are like, well, wait a minute, Mr. Terry, what if I want my money back? Well, you can go get your money back. But when they give you your money, they're not actually giving you your money. They're giving you somebody else's money, right? And so the thing about it is that banks, especially the Medici Bank, all hinged on one important idea, that not everybody would show up on the exact same day and then to request all of their money back. And we'll talk about how that blew up in everybody's face in the 1920s, all right, a little bit later on when we get to Black Tuesday and all that stuff, right? But Lorenzo, his son, also known as Il Magnifico, is going to be the guy that really sets the archetype for the Renaissance itself, right? Lorenzo Il Magnifico Medici is going to be the dude that kind of sets up the understanding of what rich people do with their money during the Renaissance, right? And what do? They patron artwork. They pay to beautify cities. They pay for gorgeous things that will be created so that they can flaunt it to their friends and family, right? He is going to create even more powerful banks. The money is going to need to be spent. And since he has this money to spend, what does he do? He uses it to patron artwork, right? He buys a whole mess of artwork, right? And what that means is he's paying people to be intelligent. He's paying people to do research. He's paying people to make new art. And that right there is the essence of the Renaissance, right? It's the funding and the economics that is going inside of it. Because this thing right here, which is my favorite sculpture in the world, that right there is, of course, Perseus holding the head of Medusa by this guy named Benvenuto Cellini, which you don't need to know this whatsoever, right? But this sculpture in general is a perfect example of the Renaissance period, right? Benvenuto Cellini was actually paid by the Medici family after Lorenzo had already died and stuff like that, because this actually came out a little bit later on. Now, the thing about it, though, is he was paid by them to create this for their sculpture garden, okay? Some of you have actually probably heard of another very famous artwork that was paid for by the Medici family. It's called the Statue of David by Michelangelo, right? Another of you might have actually heard of some other ones as well. The Birth of Venus by Botticelli, right? Primavera by Botticelli. All of those were paid for by the Medici family, right? They bought them and then used them as decorations inside of their homes, right? And literally, y'all, they would pay for anything, right? It's not always just art. Tapestries, little housewares and stuff. This right here is another piece of art that was actually made by that same guy, Cellini. This one is called the Cellini Salt Cellar, right? Now, the Cellini Salt Cellar means it is literally a piece of art that is for your table, and it held salt, right? It is a rolled enamel and gold and ivory salt cellar that you pull the top of it off, and then you use a spoon and you scoop salt out of it and you put it on your food, right? That bad boy right there is worth $60 million, all right? It's like $60 million, all right? That's a $60 million salt shaker, all right? So literally, that is what I've been talking about with the Renaissance, right? This giant rebirth and intelligence and things like that didn't necessarily just spring up on its own time. It was heavily funded by the growing economics of Europe at the time. And Florence itself is that cradle of the Renaissance, as you can see by looking just at this skyline alone, right? You are actually going to be reading an article about that specific dome right there on top of the Florence Cathedral, right? On top of the Santa Maria del Fiore, invented and created by this guy named Filippo Brunelleschi, right? So now, that dome right there is a piece of the Renaissance. Now look at this skyline real quick. Look at that dome and its smooth, curved Greek and Roman lines, right? that right there symbolized the Renaissance, whereas this building right here is the Palazzo del Vecchio, or right now the Palazzo del Vecchio. And the Palazzo del Vecchio, okay, literally means the old house. This is where literally that right there is where the Medici family lived. That's their home. Look at the old medieval battlement on it. Look how it looks more Middle Ages, right? Look how it's much more like flatter lines and less symmetry and stuff like that. And then look at the dome itself, and look how smooth and glorious and beautiful it is. And Renaissance era it is, right? So that right there is a very, very important construction or structure when you're looking at the growth of the Renaissance period, right? And I've been there with a lot of people. That right there is the that's the dome from a street level view. This is the cathedral in front of it. It's absolutely beautiful. That right there is actually the Palazzo del Vecchio, which is the old house where they actually lived. That's that sculpture I just told you all about. But going forward though, there's one other city that we need to know about, but it's technically not a northern city. It's not a northern Italian city. It's actually a central Italian city. And that central Italian city is going to be a very important place. It's known as Rome, right? Okay, now Rome is still going to be a massively important city in Italy, though, as well, which is going to stimulate the growth of the Renaissance period. What we're getting at with all these different conversations about these cities that we're talking about is to try and show you that a lot of this has to do with economics, right? A lot of this has to do with money, all right? So do these people have money to buy art? Do they have money to buy these fancy products coming from Venice, right? Do they have money to do these different things? Well, the wealthier families in Europe during this time period are getting even wealthier than they ever have been. Now, just to give you a heads up, a lot of people talk about the Renaissance structure and Renaissance culture, and they're like, oh, well, Mr. Terry, does this mean a regular person could buy art? No. For most of the people during this time period, during the 1400s, life stayed the exact same during the Renaissance, right? The Renaissance, when we're talking about it, is much more about high academics, very wealthy people, and how their lives changed, right? But a lot of it has to do with the injection of new values and new structures and new understandings inside of Europe, right? Now, Rome is a very, very important place, though, because it was also known as the capital of this place called the Papal States, right? The Papal States was the big middle chunk of Italy that was controlled by none other than the Pope, right? It was ruled over by each new Pope, right? Each new Pope controlled the city of Rome, and they used it like an authoritarian kingdom, right? Their priorities were focused on the expansion of territory and then also trying to grow their influence, right? And a lot of this was heavily affected by a document called the Donation of Constantine, right? That said that the Pope would rule over the city and rule over all of Christendom, and that they themselves would control the growth of the Catholic Church as it went forward, right? The Donation of Constantine basically said that it was a letter. It was a letter that was written by Constantine himself, apparently, that literally said that the Pope would be the largest ruling power in the Western, in the Western area of Europe, and that he would control the actual growth, lives, and governance of the people inside of that area, right? Well, the wealth of the church that began to grow to insane levels during this time is going to actually go towards the patronage of art, right? Patronage of art is going to be something really important we'll talk about a little bit later on, but what it means is to buy it, right? Okay, so since Rome and the popes and the papal states are seeing so much money come into their hands and into their possession, they're starting to buy a lot of artworks as well. They're also starting to build a lot of new places as well. For example, St. Peter's Basilica is a model of the Renaissance architectural period. It is built and designed by this guy named Bramante, right? And Bramante designed St. Peter's Basilica to meet the needs of the new Renaissance era rulership of the Pope, right? These artworks and construction, the Sistine Chapel ceiling done by Michelangelo Buonarroti, right? That work is inside of a chapel in Rome, right? And it was paid for by Pope Julius II, right? So literally that whole thing, and Rome is another great example of the expansion of Renaissance and Renaissance art, right? Now, the reason why they were getting so wealthy, though, a lot of it has to do with this thing called the tithe, right? Now, going into European history in general, something you're going to need to remember for the rest of your existence is that all of Europe at this point was Catholic, all right? They are all Catholic. There is no other type of Christian. Now, some of you are like, I didn't even know that there was another type of Christian, not Catholic, blah, blah, blah. If you didn't know that there are other types of Christians out there that aren't Catholic, right? Maybe you're going to struggle a little bit in this class, all right? Because that's something I need you to know already, all right? For example, who in this house is not a Catholic? That's right, Mr. Terry. I'm from North Carolina. We don't really have a lot of Catholics there, right? We are mostly Protestant. And you'll learn a lot about what Protestant means and why Mr. Terry's life growing up was very different from yours growing up in a religious guise and in a religious lens and stuff like that. going forward when we get into the Reformation, right? Now, the thing about it, which is right on the heels of this Renaissance period, right? If the Renaissance starts in 1450, Reformation begins in 1517, right? Just a mere 75, well, not 75, 65 years later, 67 to be specific. Now, the thing about it, though, when we're actually getting in there, the tithe, though, was an important part of Catholic religious structure during this time period. What it is it's a donation that every single Catholic, which all of Europe was Catholic, okay? Keep this in the back of your mind. All of Europe was Catholic, but it was a donation that you were required to give to the church every Sunday when you went for services, right? And it was 10% of your income, hence tithe, or a tenth, right? Now, like so, 10% of your income went to the church to provide for the priest, and a certain part of that all then went back to Rome, right? Now, I want you to think about it, though. You're the Pope, right? And you're getting money from not just two churches in Italy, but every church in Italy. Now, expand that even further. Every church in Europe is sending you money, right? Now, think about it, y'all. The tithe is a percentage. We're getting into math right now, okay? Math is very important when you're trying to understand the growth of economics throughout Europe, right? If you are looking at this, if all economics are on the rise in Europe, right, and people that used to make $100 are now making $200, right, that means that their tithe donation has to go up as well, right? Because if you used to make $100, now you make $200, you're going to, instead of paying $10 every Sunday, you're now paying $20, right, because it's 10%. So that means that as the economics of Europe went up, that means that the money being made by the church is going up as well, right? So like now, and they're going to use a lot of that money to buy a lot of art, right? So now going into it, though, as well, Northern Europe is a little bit different, though, okay? Now, when we're looking at the growth of Italian commerce and Italian economics and its influence into the Renaissance, it's an extremely important lens to look through. Now, it's not to say, though, that Northern Europe didn't have an economic boom also, right? A lot of people get very confused when they actually look into this. Northern Europe is going to have its own Renaissance, too. There's actually going to be two parts of it, right? There's going to be the Italian Renaissance and the Northern Renaissance, right? Now, the Northern Renaissance is going to come a little bit after the Italian one, right? It's going to blow up anyway a little after the Italian one. The Italian one gets on its wheels and really gets going a little bit sooner than the Northern European Renaissance does. But in Northern Europe, there's a lot of money being made there as well, right? You're going to see a lot of these new families popping up and a lot of this power structure popping up that's growing the power and influence of some of these particular families, right? Now, remember, as the rulership families get wealthier and wealthier, it's also going to give them more power. And also during the Renaissance period, you're going to see the growth of monarchs, right? And monarchs in particular and rulers in particular are going to be getting a lot more powerful. As we know, when we look at the Magna Carta, exactly. When we look at that document, right, it demonstrated how nobles during the Middle Ages had most of the power. Things are changing in Northern Europe, right? And things are changing in Italy as well. Things are changing all over the place. These families that are all over are getting more power, more influence, more economic holdings, and because of that, they're exerting more power, right? Because those two things go hand in hand. Now, Northern Europe, though, is going to see nation-states slowly forming, okay? We're seeing the kingdoms of England and the kingdoms of France and the kingdoms of Spain turning into more autonomous things, right? Turning into more large-scale kingdoms that can wage war, that can actually tax more efficiently, right? That can actually have a leader that has a little bit more power, right? Now, the dominant power, though, is still held by dynastic families, right? To give you a small list that I want you to write down on your notes right now, some of the families of Northern Europe are famous ones that you've probably heard of before, right? Ones like, for example, the Tudors of England, right? Tudor, all right? Another one in France at this time that was very, very powerful and very influential was known as the Valois of France, right? V-A-L-O-I-S, right? The Valois family of France, right? Then you also had the ones in Spain as well, which is going to be very important as we get into them a little bit more. But they're called the Castiles family, okay? Castile is spelled C-A-S-T-I-L-L-E, right? Now, the thing is, like, Isabella and Ferdinand Castile, right? So, like, these families are getting very, very powerful. But no family saw growth in power than, like, any other one than this one, right? The Habsburgs, okay? The Habsburgs, though, are the biggest and the most powerhouse family that is going to really, really change the dynamics of rulership of all of Europe going forward, right? And they're going to be growing a lot during the Renaissance period, right? Now, the Habsburgs are the Austrian powerhouse, right? They are Austrians, okay? For those of you who don't know what Austria is, this is one of those moments where you might want to do a little extra research, right? It is not my job to sit here all the time and be like, Austria is this one over here, they speak German and stuff like that. If I just said Austrian powerhouse and you don't know what Austria is, that might be a time to pause this real quick and just Google Austria, right? So like now, just to see where it is, right? Its capital is Vienna. It's absolutely gorgeous, and it used to be known as the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and before that, it was called the Austrian Habsburg Empire, right? Now the thing about it though is, what did I say? The Austrian Habsburg Empire, right? The Habsburg family reigned supreme in the Holy Roman Empire, using their wealth and marriage as a convenience to take over massive chunks of Europe, right? And they're going to use a lot of that wealth to buy a lot of art, and they're also going to use it to expand dramatically and grow their power, right? Now, the marriages of convenience thing is an important thing to understand when you're discussing the Habsburgs in general, though, right? And the Habsburgs are a great example to actually lean into when you're discussing some of these powerful Northern European families, right? That are going to end up taking over big swaths of kingdoms that will then turn into, later on, places you know of very well, like Spain, France, England, and later on down the road, a place called Germany, right? That'll be the Hohenzollern family, okay? But going into it, though, what it is, though, is let's talk about marriages of convenience, though, okay? And why the Habsburg family was such an important family in Northern European politics before the Renaissance even really exploded. A lot of it has to do with their ability, the fact that they had a lot of sons, and they found kingdoms that had a lot of daughters, right? And basically what they would do is they would take their sons and marry them off to daughter-only ruling houses of Europe. Now, what happens when their male son, who is a Habsburg, marries a female from another ruling house? Well, the Habsburgs then basically consume all those land holdings because that woman just became a Habsburg, right, once they got married. And so they did this multiple different times, and to the point that they literally became the most powerful ruling house throughout all of Europe, right? And now they also are going to do this, like to give you an example, we're showing you have these two first people to start off with. That right there is Maximilian the First. You don't need to write this down. It's just an example of the Habsburg family and how they were able to control all this land, right? That right there is Maximilian the First sitting next to his wife, Mary of Burgundy, right? And Mary of Burgundy was literally one of the ruling house women, or the last surviving, or not last surviving, the oldest surviving daughter of the House of Burgundy, right? And the House of Burgundy controlled what you now know of as the Burgundy region or Eastern France, right? So now Eastern France, he marries her, he gets all that land, right? They have a son, because now he controls not only the Austrian lands, not only is he the Holy Roman Emperor, he is now also in control of Eastern France, right? Now, if we continue to go forward, though, they have a son together. His name is Philip the Handsome. I disagree. But the big thing about it, though, is Philip the Handsome needed himself a wife. So who does he marry? A woman by the name of Joanna the Mad, right? And Joanna the Mad is the daughter of Isabella and Ferdinand Castile, right? The rulers of Spain, right? The same two people that gave Columbus the money and ships to go off and try to find a new route to India, they had one surviving eldest daughter, right? And her name was Joanna, right? And so those two got married, and they themselves had some kids as well, right? And their child would end up being the most powerful individual in the 1500s, a man by the name of Charles V, right? But to really quickly, that's him right there. That is Charles V, right, in his younger days. Now, the big thing about it, though, going into it, is as you can see, they used all these marriages and connections and all these different things to try and grow that power and influence, right? Well, the thing about it, though, is they also ended up actually marrying, well, if you start running out of new people to marry and new ruling houses to marry, you're probably going to end up marrying a lot of your cousins, right? And so, that's exactly what happened with the Habsburg family. They started crossing over lines, and sometimes you had uncles marrying nieces and, all this other weird stuff. And the funny thing that some of y'all are probably raising your hand and thinking about right now and be like, well, Mr. Terry, if they were so powerful and stuff, where are they now? Where are they now? Where'd they go? Well, actually, one of their branches died out pretty aggressively due to genetic inbreeding, right? And you also know of a very famous one as well. Marie Antoinette is of Habsburg, right? But she's an Austrian Habsburg, okay? Now, going into it, though, they actually ended up dying out in general because of all the inbreeding, because it caused a lot of medical deformities, right? That right there is the last Habsburg leader of Spain. His name is Carlos II, right? Carlos II couldn't walk until he was 4 and did not talk until he was 8. He suffered from several different, developmental delays. He would drool constantly whenever he talked, though, because he had this thing known as the Habsburg jaw, right? And the Habsburg jaw meant an aggressive underbite, right? Like a literal bottom jaw really shoving out there a ways, right? And so literally he's the example of what happens when you just have a conquest for power and land, and then you end up marrying too many of your relatives, and then you probably have webbed feet and don't know what's going on. So the thing about it, though, okay, is that right there is the nutshell, big important stuff when we're discussing all the political and economic lead up to the Renaissance period. So everything we just talked about in these last 3 flips is all that context, right? It's giving you an understanding of what just happened, right? What happened during the Middle Ages, what happened during the Renaissance, or leading up to the Renaissance period. Why did the Middle Ages go from Middle Ages to Renaissance? Is it a lot about ideas, or is it more about money? It turns out it's more about money. And now what we're getting into is the growth of this thing called Renaissance humanism. We are now going to be stepping our first feet into what the Renaissance truly is, focusing mostly in the Italian Renaissance to start, okay? So the thing about it, though, is we're now getting into the ideas of Renaissance humanism, right? And that word right there, humanism, might be one of the most important words that you have learned so far in anything I've ever discussed with you. All the stuff that we're about to be talking about right now is all the stuff that you'll see on the AP exam, right? Now, you'll see some context stuff, but it does help you when you're understanding where we're going, okay? But really, really quickly, when we're talking about the Renaissance period, what does it even mean, okay? Well, Renaissance, what it means in essence, it means in French, rebirth, right? So the Renaissance period that began around 1450, according to the College Board, because they think they know what they're talking about and they don't. So like literally what we're actually getting into is what Renaissance means is rebirth, right? In French, it means rebirth, right? But really quickly, what is being reborn, right? Because like if you're talking about rebirth, you basically mean a reemergence, right? You mean something is coming back that used to be gone, right? So for example, if something was lost, and then we found it again, now we're actually having a rebirth, right? We are bringing things back. So what is actually being reborn? Well, what is being reborn is the ancient values of the Greeks and Romans, right? We're talking about all the stuff that we started out in that first flip with, right? Remember how the Greeks and the Romans created theater, democracy, and republic, and sophisticated politics, and philosophy, and all that stuff, right? They came up with all those things that kind of disappeared during the Middle Ages because the barbarians that actually had conquered Rome started resettling the rest of Europe and developing their own cultural values and synthesizing little bits and pieces of Rome. Well, the thing about it is that the ancient Greeks and Romans had a lot of very highfalutin learning, right? A lot of the high values, a lot of philosophy, and all those different ideas that kind of got washed away during the Middle Ages for quite some time, right? Well, the thing about it, though, is they're all going to be coming rushing back, right? So the Romans and the Greeks and all their ideas, their theater, their culture, their architecture, their art, their philosophy, all of it comes flying back during the Renaissance, right? And looking at this right here, this is a painting from the Renaissance called the School of Athens. It's by a guy named Raphael Urbino, known formally just as Raphael, right? This painting serves as a great example of Italian Renaissance humanism, right? Because if we take a look at this thing, we are seeing the most famous Western philosophers, Greeks and Romans, who none of them were really, not none of them, but most of them were never alive at the same time, but they are all in the same place together, right? They're all in the same place together, sharing ideas, demonstrating their intelligence, and bringing to life the values of ancient Greece and Rome, right? Look at all of the ancient Greek and Roman architecture. The place that this is supposed to be taking place inside of is Plato's Academy, right? Plato, by the way, is right here, okay? That is Plato, the philosopher Plato, that is actually standing right there with his finger pointing up like this, right? And he actually opened up a place called the Academy, right? And he's an ancient Greek Athenian philosopher, right? And the thing about Plato is he believed that education is the freedom from ignorance and darkness, right? And he also believed that the only way for us to grow our intelligence is to come together in academy-like settings and teach one another these different skills, argue, debate, and have some philosophy. Isn't that right, big boy? So the big thing about it, though, is all his ideas were basically based in rationalism, right? Trying to use the human brain to work your way around problems using logic and reason, right? That's why he's pointing up to something, because he has all these other theories, like the theory of forms, like where are we? Is evil real? Is there another heaven? Where does everything come from? And stuff like that. So he's pointing up to things that you can't really necessarily reach out and touch, things that are ethereal and everything like that. But then next to him, you have one of his most important students, Aristotle, right? And he's pointing at his hand out like this because he's not a rationalist, he's an empiricist, right? He believes that everything that we need to know can be studied in front of us, right? Like, for example, why is my dog so cute? I don't know, he just is. But I can like look at him, scratch him, figure that out. He like barked at the delivery man earlier, so I'm like learning something by observing what he's doing, right? These two philosophers are philosophical greats. Like I told you earlier on in the last flip, literally the Arabs, who had rediscovered a lot of Aristotle's work, called him the first philosopher, and he's an ancient Greek Westerner, right? Now, the thing about it, looking at this painting as well, you have several other major figures, right? You got Socrates right there. You have apparently Alexander the Great standing right there. You've also got as well Euclid and Heraclitus, and then you also have as well, oh no, wait, that's Euclid. This is Pythagoras over here. And then you got Euclid. You have Ptolemy over here, who was the first one to come up with ideas on the stars and planets and how all those items work in space. And then you have my favorite guy ever, Diogenes. If you ever want to hear a fun story about Diogenes, just ask me about Diogenes. Be like, Mr. Jerry, what was up with the blue guy on the steps? Why is he so funny to you, right? It's funny because he lived in a barrel, but it's a whole other thing, right? So going into it, though, okay, that piece of art is a great example of how the Roman and Greek cultural values are coming back, right? Because it's all about those people and their intelligence and the rebirth of their ideas. You see what I'm talking about? Raphael, who died in the 1500s and who was alive in the 1500s and who painted that thing while Michelangelo was painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling. By the way, they hated each other's guts. It was a huge rivalry between the two of them, right? Literally, he painted that at the same time, and both his artwork and Michelangelo's artwork features Greek and Roman architecture, Greek and Roman figures, right? Greek and Roman language, right? Greek and Roman learning, all right? That is the Renaissance, right? The rebirth of those values and the injection of humanism, right? And we'll start our next flip off talking about, in our last flip, by the way, Brianna, I know I emailed you and said I had one. This is the last one. We have one more flip that'll probably be posted and recorded probably tomorrow, and you don't have to have it done until the 12th, right, which is the very first day of class, and I'm just checking them at that point, okay? But we're going to begin our next flip talking about how the Middle Ages had a very different view of these things, right? And how the Renaissance represents that rebirth and that re-emergence of these different items, okay? But I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.